Hello, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 263rd New Social Environment. I'm Malva Kajali, the events assistant here at the Rail, and today I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC for a panel on sculpture in space-time, featuring Yasue Maitake, Abigail DeVille, Lisi Raskin, and Mary Mattingly, beautifully curated by the formidable Sheila Pepe. We're also so lucky to have the poet Jennifer Soong here with us today, who will be reading a few verses to close today's program. We've started off all of our events here at the Brooklyn Rail with two important acknowledgements. The first is that here in New York, we're located on Lenapehoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and the Shinnecock Indian Nation. The second is an acknowledgement that Black Lives Matter. Although we have for many events named many of those who have lost their lives to police violence over the past year alone, I would like to dedicate today's program to Brianna Taylor, who was murdered in her sleep by police just over a year ago on March 13th, under the modern-day equivalent of the slave-era jump warrant and in anticipation of the city of Louisville's multi-million-dollar redevelopment plan, as we found out over the past year. I think this is worthwhile to remember because it reminds us, as we mourn her death, that both of these acknowledgements flow from the same extractive logics of white settler expansion and colonialism on which this country was built. I encourage you all to check out the chat shortly for a living document of the resources and actions that we've been exploring as we do our part in the learning and unlearning required to undo these legacies of injustice. And finally, today we're joined by a panel of sculptors. I'm so excited to welcome them. They're all fabulous and formidable. We lead with Yasue Maitake, a Tokyo-born artist living and working in New York, recently named one of 20 international women advancing the field of sculpture by Artsy. She's joined by Abigail DeVille, whose work is, one moment, let me spotlight you, whose work is defined by a long-standing interest in marginality, both people and places. She creates fantastical site-specific immersive installations featuring Cabinet of Wonders style collected objects to highlight these stories of the forgotten. And next up, we have Lisi Raskin, who builds bridges between queer ontologies, utopian architecture, abstraction, engaged pedagogies, and so much more. When they're not heading the Department of Sculpture over at RISD, they're laughing, learning, cooking, and performing as part of the rock band Peebles. And recently they collabed on a demo album of propaganda for children of all ages. Very excited about that, and we'll drop that in the chat shortly. And joining and matching Lisi in whimsy is Mary Mattingly, a sculptor and photographer based in New York. She founded a floating food forest on a reclaimed barge up the Bronx River, both a public artwork and floating edible landscape. And we're so excited to have you. And keeping them in company and in questions is the wonderful Sheila Pepe, an artist, educator, and queer elder based in Brooklyn. She's exhibited widely, been anthologized all over the place, and is about to take us on a wild, wild ride. So Sheila, handing the microphone over to you.
Thank you so much. I want to thank Fong, of course, and Nick Bennett, and all the Brooklyn Rail folks, and our group leader here, Malvika, with us today, and to Yasue, Abigail, Mary, and Lisi, thanks for joining me on this thought experiment. In 1962, John Glenn was the first American to orbit the Earth. My generation was taught to understand this as a product of uniquely American ambition and technology. Lost to us was the post-World War II triumphalist narrative, the submerged Cold War arms race, and the ambient colonialism. For many of us, space travel seen on TV was already a vivid event. As a child in the early 1960s, I was captivated by Nichelle Nichols, or as we knew her, Lieutenant Uhura, the communications and translation specialist on Star Trek. I wasn't the only one. In fact, she was an inspirational model for Dr. Mae Carroll Jemison, the first Black woman astronaut. 30 years after Glenn spun around the world, the US flew her to work on the International Space Station. Of course, the Star Trek people found out about it and cast her in an episode of The Next Generation, and so thereby collapsing the real and the fictional with the 19 version of a next progressive future. However, I always wonder, what would have happened if we were encouraged to think past the TV narratives, both fact and fiction, and the prowess of American technology to a sound understanding of the underlying science. Why is science so problematic in the United States? Think of all the corrupted science that's been tolerated in this country. Eugenics at its height in 1923, still around. Man-made climate change, a topic discussed since the 1960s and confirmed with data in the 1990s, still a problem. And then there's COVID-19. Okay, so many of us still live in the physical terms defined by Sir Isaac Newton, who died in 1727. The absoluteness of his reality meant that apples fell straight from the trees, pulled by an invisible force, and space was a pure entity, as fixed and absolute as God was in his heavens. In truth, our bodies have been living in a much different physical reality for at least 100 years, even if our minds have not. In 1905, Albert Einstein replaced all of this fixity with special relativity, and in 1916, general relativity with the help of mathematicians and other physicists. Special relativity applies to all the physical phenomena in the absence of gravity. It's where we get the idea of space-time. And general relativity explains the laws of gravitation in space-time and its relationship to other forces of nature. In one of my favorite science fiction narratives, Rocky Horror Picture Show, the mantra is, don't dream it, be it. This might be the not so secret mantra of scientists all over the world. I'm really struck when science outperforms the fiction described in art, when the fantastic imaginings of, say, Remedios Varo or Hieronymus Bosch come alive in the Vacanti mouse born in the mid-1990s, or the captivating tricks of levitation performed here by this painting by Rene Magritte are overwhelmed by superconductivity in 1986. Examples like these confirm to the fact that our colleagues in the sciences are often as imaginative as we are. They imagine how to best explain the nature of the universe as it is, rather than how we'd like it to be, and must do it in terms plainly demonstrated by a global audience. Often I wonder what would happen if we flip the equation. If we had to take, say, Einstein's relativity to make and frame our work as artists, as sculptors. What if everything we made had to be explained in terms of space-time? First, we would have to understand that space is far from empty. Like, imagine a very light expanse of gelatinous-like substance filling the universe. Next, remember that time is relative to every location within this thing we call space. Now, we don't see these things much since they're not recorded easily at the scale we live in, but both Galileo and Einstein have given us really great examples of practical understanding of the phenomenon. And then to this understanding, we would understand that gravity is not a force of attracting objects to the center of the earth, for example, like with a big magnetic thing. Rather, it's large masses like our earth and the sun create distortions in the goo of time-space. It's not just a dimple on a sheet, but displacements that create curves in space-time around a massive object. It means that our solar system, the Earth and its sister planets, are not rotating around the sun. Planets are actually traveling in a straight line. However, our paths are altered by the concentric wraps and warps of space-time created by the enormous mass of the sun. So I've asked each of our four wonderful sculptors here today to consider this proposition. So let's just proceed and see what they have to say. Thanks.
So first up, we'll have Yasue Maitake, and I'm so excited to look at your work, Yasue.
Okay, hold a second, I will prepare right now.
And Yasue just had a beautiful show close at Microscope Gallery, who I believe is actually in attendance.
Thank you. Okay, hold a second.
Of course.
Okay, well, thanks to Sheila and Malvika organizing for today's event. I'm gonna show the total 20 images. My work is usually small to life-size objects, which both found and raw materials. For example, this is roughly 8 to 9 feet tall. That is my most comfortable size ranges working with objects. And this is an example of miniature pieces around 12 inches tall. The materials are across all natural substances like fiber, wood, rocks, seashells, and then animal bones. And some industrial components, typically metal, glass, or resin. Sometimes my art makes sense as abstraction, but sometimes it is close to a direct natural observation. For example, these detailed sculpture parts seemingly look like a realism, but such anatomy is totally fictional that doesn't exist. Perhaps the character of non-specificity and its organic form is simply generated by the result from my vague memories around my real life events. In a sense, my work is in between the fantasy and the structural reality. In this 8 feet tall sculpture, I cooperate with aerodynamic expression inspired by Baroque sculpture, depicting a cluster of drapey fabrics movement in the imaginary wind. In doing so, I hope to connect the animated or animistic view of the world, which is hinted throughout my sculptures. On the other hand, my interest has been always the physicality of reconstruction instead of letting the things being deconstruction as a goal. By reflecting my question to society with a lack of direction and the concern only deconstruct without providing any resources for the idea of reconstruction. I also applied handmade papers into more three-dimensional sculpture, letting gravity take control to create a drape effect around the metal or cane armatures. This is my collaboration piece with Andrew Erodos to simply bring our each signature materials and builds such as broken safety glasses or corroded papers to tell the idea that the artists are incapable of changing the nature, but all what we can do is rather to manipulate their appearance only. These ideas are often applied by the larger scale sculptures, such as public art or installation. For example, here, this is my installation at the Chimney Gallery in 2017. I set up the temporary second floor by the construction scaffolding where the viewers were able to climb up, experiencing various height and angles. I wanted to express how the commonly thought of basic nuts and bolts, the life essential to become artwork, as my interest has been always rebuilding something out of decay, which is my extension of idea reconstruction instead of the statement of deconstruction. Well, this is my latest series, which was presented in my most recent solo show at Microscope Gallery, which just finished last week. My presentation could be viewed as a straightforward pedestal or freestanding settings where I characterize the white cube as a distinctive expression itself. I always wanted to illustrate my mixed feelings of connection or desire to be released from Earth's gravity, but it's not in a sense of pure fantasy, as I always embrace the physical burden and then reality by hinting through engineered stability. Or it can be a simple question, how things are made. So the gravity becomes my symbolism, including the three-dimensional problem solvings, letting the object figure out their various freestanding postures on the ground. By the way, when it comes to the motifs, as I'm often taking inspiration from slightly obvious icons of Japanese animism and Baroque sculpture by blending these two elements, I try to strive my own cultural eclecticism, which is part of my long-term exploration or my investigation, what the animated matter means to me by blending these two elements and exploring their common, especially in contrast to use of such rigid and heavy materials like rocks, metal, or animal bones. I wanted to challenge the viewers to what extent I can disguise the impression of gravity's burden revolved around the viewer's expectation of mass and then volume. And I really wanted to express how I see the still or static object as a living agency, like an energy cycle, molecule, or living cells that are constantly moving as a transitional state. It is interesting for me to observe how and what is commonly thought as an engineering process, which constructing the thing will eventually become the art. A final thought, I hope to see some kind of new lifelike form which appeared in. That is something I see beyond strictly human and humanity, which I wish passing on to the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Next up, we'll be hearing from the fabulous Abigail DeVille. Y'all don't have to be so formal. We can chat in the middle. This is our party.
Are you showing them or I'm showing them?
What's your preference? I can show them. I have them open. But if you'd like to do it, you can do it.
No, you can do it.
All right. I love the earrings today.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to start off with reading a quote from Lonnie Holly. Time for me works like a door. You have to go through time in order to be in it. It seems like one big cycle from within, like a spring. You start at the innermost part of the spring and you move outward as you grow. And as you grow, this materialistic body, which is flesh, takes its place and acts. Then it falls back to the beginning to recreate itself. Time is standing still if one is not moving in it. And if one is moving in it, time moves so fast that we cannot keep up with it. We can speed through time and then we can be in time and not move at all. Man could stay still and time won't even matter. But if man is moving in time and trying to keep up with time itself, then he'll somehow or another be like time, run out himself, because there is no distance, there is no limit, no space hidden. So in thinking through that term, no space hidden, or everything being exposed under the heavens, or even thinking about our own physical relationships to the cosmos and the stars, and how 5% of our bodies are made up of stardust, and thinking about how everything isn't convergent all at once, I scavenge for local materials and make poetic meditations on the history of a particular site and location and erasure of a cultural history within that place. So this is, if I think I'm sinking, it's something like that. Wait, if I don't think I'm sinking, look at what a hole I'm in, which was at Night Gallery in 2012 in Los Angeles. You can go to the next one. And so for me, this was like a convergence of humanity in communication with its original origins, with the stars, in terms of these people being trapped within limbo in the cosmos of the gallery ceiling. Next one. Okay. So I use a lot of black plastic and a lot of plastic, which is here with us now for forever, in a lot of installations, and making this connection in the puncturing and stabbing through, and thinking through if you can actually disrupt or dematerialize an object and change the formation of that. What relationship is that to time? So through the poetry of everyday experience in American history, I create black hole room-sized sculptures that speak to different strands in American society. Black holes are containers that are laden with forgotten information, the absence of light, power, knowledge, and the harbinger of historical inaccuracies. Using celestial forms to think about our place in history links us to a 4 billion year timeline. And everything is connected. In quantum mechanics, the observation of a subatomic particle changes it. You can never really be sure if it even existed before you looked at it. And since you looked, you interfered with what it was before. We affect everything around us just by how we see it or what we believe. If everything is connected, can you change the universe on a molecular level by observation? So there's something else that's continuing to happen in these particular works, which are just black hole works, is there's a curving within a rectangle. So there was an actual circle in this rectangular space in which there was a body here on the floor, which was covered from dirt that I got from Lake Michigan. This was in Rogers Park on the north side of Chicago. And Rogers Park was, or there is a street there, I'm forgetting the name of it right now, but there is an intersecting line there. It runs on a diagonal from Lake Michigan, which was the original demarcation line between settlers and Native Americans. And so, and thinking about, and coming across actually an apartment building there that the interior had been ripped out, and I used these materials to talk about the kind of cyclical displacement happening in that neighborhood. And this is similar in another neighborhood in Vancouver called Gastown Follies. It's called Intervention 2014. And so it was for a production called She Talks to Beethoven, which is an Adrian Kennedy play that was at Jack in Brooklyn in 2014. It's based on a Richard Serra sculpture, but it's constructed out of reclaimed theater flats and blew them apart with drills, and making this connection again to thinking about the ways in which if I'm standing in one point in space and you're standing in another point in space and something happens and we're both in the same place and time, we'll never have the same perspective. And so in thinking in the ways in which we embody so many different kinds of multiplicities that can never be duplicated from one body to the next, from one experience to the next, trying to create the experience for the audience to not be able to have a fixed place or understanding of the space and content within the performance. So this is Midsummer Event Horizon, which was set design I did for Peter Sellers at the Stratford, Ontario Shakespeare Festival in 2014. And it was Midsummer's Night Dream, and he cut up all the parts and had it played between 4 actors on that stage, which I had them airbrush paint bastardized Caspar David Friedrich, and then the audience sat under, it were actually inside of the black hole, and they sat under the sea of locally sourced debris. So this is called No Space Hidden Shelter, in parentheses, and thinking through the kinds of development that was at the ICA LA in 2017, and thinking through the different ways in which the earth was being excavated and different neighborhoods are being demolished and redeveloped, and the precarity of ICALA's location across the street from the Greyhound bus station in East LA in the Arts District, which is helping to displace, encroach upon the socially accepted and understood, donut in the middle of Skid Row. And so the structure of this installation itself is based on a diagram of the interior of a black hole, and so all of these objects are being sucked in by the force of the gravity of that thing.
These are so gorgeous. I just love it. It's like you're the archaeology of like so many locales. Well, thank you so much. And I believe next we will be viewing a short film by our very own Lisi, which should be queuing up just now.
Should I say a thing as an introduction, maybe?
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, just a brief thing to talk about this piece called Cry Hiking. And it's a prose poem that attempts to like assemble new narratives around things that already exist. I've become increasingly, maybe I've always been, but it's become more and more clear to me recently that I am interested in materials, matter, and beings that cradle, support, and show tenderness toward one another by holding space for touching, kneading, and forming, moving toward. So I'm searching and trying to create a greater sense of relationality. I'm exploring and invested in a belief that things are contingent, that people are contingent, that living things are contingent, that we're interconnected. And the pursuit of longing and loving and respecting beings and being co-present and allowing for the affective dimension that makes that tenderness possible. So I'm really happy to share this video with you. So thank you.
Asking the woods that day was as clarifying as it was confounding. It's best to proceed here, vulnerable, learning, in a state of perpetual openness. I was looking not just for signs, but proof that forms of entanglement, forms of dependency that I could not yet imagine existed. It's called cry hiking. I try to do it most afternoons in the sweet spot of winter light. A beacon, literally calling to me with arms outstretched, a through line, an arrow pointing me toward an outcropping. I walked toward it without conscious awareness that I was walking toward anything. What is that? What is happening right there? Look, that black oak is touching, becoming, engulfing that glacial boulder. Phil says where they touch, the edges between two systems are amazingly fecund and fertile. Actually, he said that the edges between two systems is where it's at, but I knew what he meant. If a glacial boulder had sat on this place since the last ice age, anywhere between 2.6 million and 11,700 years ago, and this tree had been up to its work of creating the circumstances to break down the minerals that compose this boulder for around 200 years, well, that's a hell of a long game. The top of the boulder told another story. This tree is a bit closer to my own age, 46.9 years, blown over, so to speak. These phrases stop making sense when we stop assuming that the oak's purpose is measured by its verticality. Can we measure purpose by how a life form helps the life forms around it thrive? Could I measure my own life in this way? Can I? Relationships, points of connectivity, mutuality, nurturance, the viewfinder, urging me to walk around it. This event, this state change was so fresh, the imprint left by the underside of the soil and root network was visible on the rock, like some elementary school cyanotype, a question of inevitable exposure. A single root had burrowed in and set about the task of anchoring to place. A single root, by capillary action, could infiltrate and split apart a structure that I assumed was permanent. I would like to thank the so-called oak and the so-called glacial boulder.
So good. It's all so good. This accumulation is just blowing my mind.
We're pretty
Yeah.
lucky. We're lucky,
Yeah.
Sheila. Thank you for bringing us together.
It's just more than making me more than happy. Okay, Mary, you're up.
Yeah, so as a short preface, I've taken a past writing that jumps from the macro scale to the micro on a storytelling journey that's inspired by Sheila's prompt, and also to follow these journeys like through deep time. And I could start with the video. Thanks. So whether the oceans accumulated gradually over millions of years from the escaping vapors of molten rock that comprised the Earth's crust and clung to a proto-atmosphere surrounding the cooling planet, or whether millions of celestial comets breached the frost line during a time of interplanetary collision, their icy planetesimals flung by the force of trans-Neptunian objects, blasting, dividing, and melting, or by some divining force, the moon did form, thereby fixing the Earth's gravitational field, and the rain did come. The Earth, as protoplanet, attracted typhoons of nebula gases and built a distended compositional atmosphere. A steam atmosphere was formed by impact degassing from Earth-building planetesimals. Gravitational pull prevented hydrogen from leaving the planet, and the proto-atmospheric layer lingered. A runaway greenhouse effect was no match for the metamorphosing vaporous shield, the mist, cloud, rain, hail, snow, or sleet. Although lighter elements like hydrogen and helium would continue to seep from the atmosphere into the space of particular cosmic order. Over time, seas did form by Neptunian violence and abyssal sea quakes, alluvian cascades, deluges, outpourings, eruptions, torrents, tourbillons, eddies, and seismic spates. Through speculative readings of isotopic ratios of the heavier noble gases, scientific consensus accepted that the protoplanetary Earth had lost at least one ocean of water between the Hadean and Archean eras. Approximately 400 million years ago, the evaporation of a shallow sea resulted in the accumulation of hundreds of meters of sodium chloride in the area now called New York. As seas evaporated, dissolved solids formed halite, gypsum, and potash salts. Rain, with its one molecule of carbon dioxide due to the ocean action called marine snow, eventually produced a circumterrestrial procession of leaking elements. The sodiums, calciums, magnesiums, and potassiums dissolved from dense rock-like formations and the explosive upheaval of volcanic activity until the open ocean was 35% saline. Thick deposits of calcified minerals led to the occurrence of salt domes, which gave way to petroleum traps as verdure vegetation became matted and the seabed transformed into swampy wetlands. Algae, mosses, and peats were entombed under the weight of overlying mud and acidic waters. As plant debris sifted deeper underground, it encountered increased temperatures and higher pressure. Subbituminous carbon swelled and released, and beneath the mountains grew a fossilized mineral-rich forest, while atop the crust, an ocean fed from carbon dioxide, absorbed and fixed into phytoplankton cells through the process of photosynthesis, swarming with life. 10,000 years ago, ocean waters began to be used for much more than local fishing and travel. Records regarded salt as a well-performing asset from production to meat curing. Salt exploration, accoutrements, salt taxes, and salt monopolies came with the tides. With the prominence of salt, fish demand grew, the boats grew in technological prowess. Some fish stocks struggled to maintain their upward mobility, and their feedback loops began to distort. In 1609, Dutch philosopher Hugo Grotius published a book of international law, Mare Liberum, or The Freedom of the Seas. The book is in one sense about the human right or privilege to live without restrictions of borders. The areas outside of the open ocean of established national waters are considered the high seas and cover more than 2/5 of the surface of the earth. When Grotius wrote Mare Liberum, the high seas, for some, were still a place of wonder and lacunas instead of loopholes. So it presented a view of the high seas as a global commons, belonging to and in the care of all humanity and the earth itself. In fact, photosynthesis on the high seas provides the air we breathe. Commons are best managed when there's equitable access to them. Because few people have direct access to the high seas, a water-based commons can seem utopian or out of reach. Today, the high seas remains a workaround for countless entities with resources to cross them, who can evade local taxes and regulations through them, and traffic on them. Ships still operate under notions like flags of convenience, registering vessels under a country with the least regulations, and the high seas remain a space where traumas are knit to trade. Well, it took 3.8 billion years to sequester the salty minerals that surround New York City and build a freshwater flow. It took less than 100 years of industrial experimentation to corrupt it. The 24-mile-long Bronx River, or indigenous Akwang, is not on the high seas, but is considered a commons by neighbors who abide by the ethos and the rights that the watery commons come with responsibilities. You can go to the next video. To fight for its protection. In a turn of fate, the Bronx River originally rose in what is now the Kensico Reservoir. During the 1820s and 30s, the New York City Board of Aldermen debated ways to tap into it to supply the city with drinking water. But the construction of the Kensico Dam, the river was cut off from its natural headwaters, and from then on depended on a tributary stream. Today, the lower Bronx River is tidal and brackish. It never had a water-based port, but after the events of September 11th, lower Manhattan seaport markets and additional food distribution centers were moved to the Bronx, where they now contour the riparian edge of the city's land-based exchange hub, the Hunts Point Produce Market, a place where neighbors can't readily buy vegetables, but barges and container ships navigate the river with relative ease, cut through choppy seas, glide through borders, rest at the Port of New York, New Jersey, where they offload foodstuff containers that are trucked north to the Bronx and then back out again at a rate of 10,000 trucks a day. So food can be distributed around New York City, neglecting the immediate vicinity. Next slide, please. So swale is the name of a barge that was built in part from abundant dissolved iron in the Earth's oceans over 1.8 billion years ago that eventually formed rock, and from an inventive human methodology that extracted it. The barge was then used to carry sand, dredged up from the silty wetlands that surrounded the 5 boroughs in order to make shipping lanes, and is now transformed into a floating food forest. In a city where 1 in 3 persons lives in what is considered a food desert, swale points to other forms of extraction, but also regeneration. With the Bronx River Alliance and Youth Ministries for Peace and Justice, swale docked adjacent to Concrete Plant Park, neighboring Hunts Point, a park that's named after its history as a concrete plant where sand was shipped in daily, and there it acted as a catalyst for what could happen in public parkland. While there are 100 acres of community gardens in New York City, the city cares for 30,000 acres of public parkland. So growing or picking food on public land here has been illegal for almost a century, and Swale's an intentionally provocative public artwork that uses the common law of the water as a loophole in order to be a platform where anyone can pick fresh foods for free, sort of expanding food access as well as interdependent imaginaries for a future New York City replete with more access to food-bearing spaces. I read Swale through the lens of a heterotopia, or even more optimistically an ecotopia, because ecotopias can hold that in our uncertain times, reclaiming the power of utopian thinking through a socio-ecological lens can be a critical means of interrogating dominant systems and offering alternative visions. Swale is a folly that resembles a small island. Water's buoyant properties based on the density of an object and not on the 6,800 metric tons of dead weight, allow the hollow barge to bob up and down on the water at the edges of New York City's land. In a dance with disintegrating elements extracted from deep under the soil line, the barge, which rusts, swells, chips, repairs, and ballasts, is a container for plants who spread their roots past the city compost line, the soil line, and into the lava, rock, and gravel before finally finding their way deep into the heavier elements on the periodic table, including the alloyed iron. Venturing on board offers its own transformation, first in the form of a perspective shift. While sitting on an orchard atop its hill, the city appears to be moving, not the island. It's out of place in order to ask people to question their surroundings, from polluted waterways to lack of equitable access to fresh food. But it follows a traditional ecological knowledge and the insights of Eleanor Ostrom, who claimed that in a vibrant commons, people had a vital role to play, not only as beneficiaries, but as co-creators, protectors, and decision makers. As a direct result of Swale and the support of community groups, in 2017, the New York City Parks Department opened their first public foodway at Concrete Plant Park in the Bronx, parting with the city's own law about picking from public space. So as an artist, I think of interventions like Swale as sculpture, but also as durational platforms. So the maintenance is as important as the initial impulse. I think platforms can shift people's perceptions about these essential elements, including water. And when enough elements or actors or agents or groups align, a change in perception can become a change in purpose. So I think, like many places across the US, the drinking water where I grew up was polluted from chemicals that were used in industrial agriculture. And I will end there. Thank you for listening to my long read.
That was great, Mary. And
It was definitely fun.
Thanks, Mary.
Yeah.
Mary, my God.
I'm just totally wowed because I didn't know exactly what everything was. I mean, I purposely don't think I knew exactly everything that was going to happen here. And so I guess my first thought is, do you have questions for each other that might open things up? Yeah, Mary's nodding her head. Is that?
Yeah. Oh, so many. I think, I was really curious about, I think this prompt was great because it's not often that, at least I get to think about artwork in this way. And I was really intrigued with how many of us thought about gravity and elevation and like its properties and how we could escape them in a way.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's a question, but it's just something that I'm thinking about.
Yeah. Well, I'll ask everybody's, I love Lisi's evocation of the touch because it's something we're all craving right now, I think, beyond our significant others. And if you have one, you're very lucky. But then there are these forces, like each one of you described a variety of forces. And I'm it's from the touch to like on Abigail's end of things, the event horizon of a black hole, which is another really radical force. So I'm wondering if you would all share like this performance of space, of space-time as it laces through your daily work and your sculptural work, because I can hear in all of you that there's this continuum. Maybe Yasue, when you talk about this marriage of animism and Baroque sculpture, there's a sense of touch there that is, I would say it's the touch of balance, or the touch of bodies that are, you know, that are alive, that most Westerners don't think are alive. Like, we are not encouraged to think of inanimate stones, for stones to be alive in the way that you might have grown up with. The too obtuse. I think you're muted. Yeah.
Hi. For me, the example of these two motifs, references, Baroque and animism, it's very natural, common thoughts in terms of the constant movement and in transitional state, how we perceive or illustrate the solid static object.
Mm-hmm.
But it took time for me to convey this idea to the viewers and the listener, even with a simple chat, that it seems that, yeah, a lot of people think that why these two have some common. And so then it's always, idea comes as an inspiration and enlightening of intuition first, but then my approach is whether visually or verbally, that decoding how to create the communicable tools to appeal to the viewers. So yeah, I've been developing, well, so far, just with my own development history. So yes, animism on the other, on one hand of animism, which is very strong image of a traditional classical or ancient form of our perception of the world, which is not necessarily non-Western's possession. When we look at the early civilization, that basically whole planet, for this planet was covered by animistic view of the world, such as worshiping the sun, goddess, or Poseidon, and so on. So this is one thing. And Baroque sculpture is not necessarily an image of a brand new technology, but it's still very wild technology and perception, and an attempt to the static materials such as marble stone carving, and then how the Baroque sculptors expressed so vividly about the lively moment of, like, as if angels are flying, like that, that contradiction. So these two, like, kind of a future's advancement and then past nostalgic or like ongoing tradition both fused together in my head. So I have to keep working for this subjective justification to communicate with the viewer, but that is a very exciting, challenging in general.
Well, I think, you know, I must confess that this whole thing happened in part because, well, many things, but that we don't speak enough about the power of sculpture and the language of sculpture, or talk about three-dimensional things in the language of sculpture. And in your work, I find, you know, all these rich cultural connections and challenges in the traditional language of sculpture that requires the body to engage in space in the most fundamental and metaphorical ways. And that we're all engaged to some degree in that metaphor. I mean, and we see in varying degrees, you know, by the time we get to Mary's work, the metaphor is turned into a literally, in this case, a platform, floating platform that that it demonstrates a great understanding of the long time of the physicality of what has brought us here. But it's also, as she said, something that has to be sustained. So is it sculpture anymore? I don't know. I don't really care. But it's by using the language of sculpture, we can understand it in ways that allows us all to share common cultural ground, which is, I guess, my aim.
Yes.
Yeah. Is Abigail in the
Abigail,
in the house?
Yes.
You're here. So
Abigail in the house.
I'm like totally, you know, it's like your moves of going from like serious micro experience, the experience of the individual body in you know, not just in space-time, but in culture space-time, to the macro of these big space, big science, big, you know, huge enterprises of physical reality as we know them. I'm curious about how that came to be. I mean, what moved you out to this, to that platform that you invoke through all this detritus, which is like, there's a kind of, it's almost crazy. It's like, oh, I know that once we get inside the event horizon, Patsy, we're all goosh. I mean, like, it's so violent, but you get to animate it in this very personal way. And I'm curious what brought you to the language of science. It's a big one, sorry. I don't know, it's like, what was the first time you thought of it?
I'm gonna have to say, I don't know why I'm thinking my grandma, but
Yeah, that's cool.
I'm thinking grandma. But I think it's only because, and I told you recently that she was like this reservoir or depository for people who were trying to get rid of things in the building. So I called her the unofficial archivist of that building. And so her like open arm, democratic approach, non-hierarchical approach to material is what like started me thinking about it. And then also I think it was really then finding out that fact that, you know, like that we're, you know, 5% of our bodies is the same stuff that is in the stars. And so then thinking about then how everything actually, you know, and in that particular moment, I was trying to reconcile this spatial relationship of like a cramped project apartment, you know, versus like the infinite expanse of the universe, right? Like that some materials that are the same things that are in the universe are also inside of that apartment, right? And then how, because of mental construction, societal constructions and constraints, that prevents us from actually seeing ourselves, and how that, you know, totally derails, you know, potential, you know, I guess like outgrowings, or like an octopus with tentacles or something, you know, like all the actual connections that we could really make and invent. And so that
right
that
now
was
you're like, right now when you're speaking, you're really connecting to a lot of the same sentiment Lisi expressed, but in radically different ways, right? It's like that L connectivity. I mean, I love this theme that threads throughout all of you in terms of trying to find a bigger frame and some shared ground to show each other something about our experiences, how different they are. But it, you know, it's like you can't show the difference without a bigger context. You know, the difference doesn't exist unless you open the field to it. And then once it gets bigger and bigger, you see way more diversity and complexity and connectivity that is often beyond understanding. And I feel that way about art as well. And I think that, Lisi, I'm wondering how you're feeling about that, because I mean, you bring an artistry to the way you look at everyday life that I've known for a while, and to teaching, which I've heard you speak about, and but it's visual, but it's so sculptural in my mind, because you're able to read the environment as its sculpture. I mean, as we've learned to give the environment meaning, to give objects meaning, to evoke. I mean, that's the language that I'm hoping to reanimate. And God knows I love painting, but I think that's sculpture too. I think it's all sculpture if you have to find a frame from the art world that applies. But it's a leaky vessel. So Lisi, I'm curious what you're thinking about the mechanism of seeing and reading and acting in the world through this kind of sensitivity to the reading of one's experience.
Well, I'll just say that in 2013, I had the opportunity to go to Afghanistan, at which point I just realized that I was completely ignorant. Like none of my lenses, none of my filters, none of my knowledge was applicable. And it was every day. It was every day for a number of weeks, which drilled into me the very real possibility that upon returning home, I was no less ignorant, that the things I had learned were no less troublesome and inaccurate and motivated. And so I think teaching was really helpful because it reinforced that idea that I had a suspicion about, but I think I didn't always understand when I was young, that what we do, what we put in the world, what we say, like it has a consequence. And I think there's no bigger teacher than being in a room with artists where there's an asymmetrical power dynamic. To be like, oh, wow, I really need to act with care here. So I think care as a lens, and I think that there are a lot of discourses and practices that have helped me along the way. But like being in a body, a vulnerable body, is a big deal. And understanding the vulnerability and not even like, because I think vulnerability is really important and beautiful. And a place to move from, if possible, if it's possible for us. But just noticing that everything is trying to say something has a reason to be like, and I couldn't put it into a slot within my Western brain because that's not the place to move from. So in approaching, I mean, when you prompted us to think through science, I think I really bristled, you know. And I mean, it was the love brush, but it was bristly. And I think, you know, like I can't stand outside of this and pretend that I'm not of it. And I can't, like when I realized someone was like, hey, you know, your cat is a prisoner in your house. And I was like, what the hell with me and interspecies relationships? Like, what's my problem? How do I need to think about this differently? And these are things said in passing, like you should know this, that this is the possibility that you're reckoning with another creature is an improper one. And so what then is a deeper listening? And I didn't invent this. And clearly I am part of a settler culture, like bent on erasing this. But like, what does it mean to like take a walk in the woods and be like, Woods, this is hard. Like, what? I need to see something, please. Like, can you show me another form of relationality that's going to help me like be like different? Because I need to be different. The things I put in the world need to be different, and what I utter needs to be different. So,
well, that moment you found in the woods is just so spectacular, and so oddly probably would have been ordinary if we hadn't built everything over it. But yeah, it's like when you begin to recognize what it is and how it happened and get the language to it, it's the same thing. You read it for what it is and how long it's taken. I mean, I think my only argument with some of that is that your cat is also an animal in time space, which means that it's the child of many, many generations of alterations that may or may not be okay out in the wild again. So then you might be okay with having that animal die, you know, like subject it to something that it's not, like, I don't know if we're capable of living out in the wild again. You know, it's like finding ourselves in the moment we are and managing it. But this is a longer conversation between the two of us. I mean, the thing that I love is that I don't care if you hate this idea. This is my desire, is to remember that as flawed as it is, those of us who have spent most of our lives making art come out of COVID realizing that for myself, it's quite small. It's quite a small thing. But that sculpture in its short history has always asked us to find things in the world that exist beyond the art world, that exist in the same space we live in and stumble in. And so we have to grapple. We have to either stub our toe or destroy it or send it off, let it dissolve. Or and I find, you know, like, you know, Mary, the knowledge that goes into this thing that, you know, Mary, I'll just say that you, among others here, I think Yasue and I are the only ones who started our art making lives as people who make objects. Everybody, the other three of you have become default sculptors, and also are painters, right? Or photographers. But you all entered the realm of three dimensions, as we call it today, or what we could think of as space-time, with a sense of urgency that feels palpable, because to take up space is something, it's a big deal. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, can you just talk about the first time you took up space in that way? And
well, I can say that I think science was of interest, or my interest in science came out of fear, maybe, or anger, and finally maybe love. And that had to probably do with learning how to clean water to drink. And that was something that, like, more and more the world has had to know how to do. And then when I moved from, I think, making these sort of post-apocalyptic photographs about, you know, present and potential futures, and I was able to do make a sculpture, co-build a sculpture in public space with the help of lots of engineers and specialists, and people who had volunteered their time to build a floating platform. I guess I learned that people all over the city have so much more knowledge about all of these living systems and ecosystems than any of us had combined. And that system just became robust and good, you know, the more people who had access to it and could participate in it and share ideas. And, you know, so at the end of that project, it was, it actually worked. And at the beginning, it was a stage for something that could.
Thanks. Malvika, I'm wondering if we should, what our time is like and whether we should open things up. If you've got some questions that you can see.
Yeah.
Are you guys cool with that?
How does
There's
everyone
really
feel?
good stuff in the chat.
Yeah, we have some
Okay.
beautiful questions that have come in.
Do you want to pick one out, Lisi?
Okay. Wonderful conversation all. This is from Cal McKeever. My question is the following. You all seem to work in expansive ways far beyond the traditional white cube space. How do you see institutions adjusting to artists and sculptors working on such a scale? What curatorial limitations do you see?
I think that's
I think
very
we can all
beautiful
start
place to
laughing
open.
now. It's so sweet. Because I know Abigail's laughing. Abigail and I were laughing the other night about the how few spaces there are in New York that even consider this as a way of working anymore. You know, there used to be a lot of not-for-profits that were really excited about work that didn't meet a market at all. But, you know, I think of the old Exeter Art as one of the most expansive places. People who came out in the 90s can talk about a lot of things, but there are definitely curatorial issues. Maybe they're state funding it and cities funding issues. I mean, the United States has to become a place that embraces culture as a meaningful enterprise. And, you know, other than that, we will just need to persist, in my view. I don't know. We all get by. You guys, you have ideas about this?
I mean, I do have ideas about like exiting the institution
Okay.
and stopping this like relationship where I keep expecting something to serve me that wasn't set up to. I
Yeah.
think that there are many art worlds, and I've increasingly interested in ones that form out of necessity, made by people that have the need for community. And I think that it's been different. I mean, I'm just aware, Sheila, that, you know, this is a different time than, like, you can recall different things about feeling in community previously. And I just, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I work at an institution and I'm like, how do I get the hell out of here? Like, how do I get out of this? So I think that it's a daily act of like kind of resisting the way that it wants to extract and recuperate. And I just wonder, I don't know, like maybe that's provocative, but I wonder how other folks feel about the institutions and refusal and resistance and or community and participation.
It is a big one.
I mean, I think community and participation is where it's at, right? Like that's the historicizing of the present moment. That's the encapsulating of material and stories and information and seeds for the future and rethinking the ways that we see and think of ourselves, and then that being like a you know, like a map for you know, people ahead of us. I don't know what to say about institutions because you know, they're all tied up in their own constraints with their inability to be able to maybe act on their own convictions because of money, right? So I mean, I don't know about the state of that, but
yeah, I mean, I think it's also, you know, I found that at different points in my life I've been more and less involved in institutions, especially teaching. Then I found a good way to find myself spit out of every one of them by not understand, you know, like just by being, which is fine. But it's different now, especially since, well, it's different in New York City, I would say, that I feel like if all these empty spaces that I see on the street, say of 23rd Street near the stay empty, then maybe there's an opportunity to do interesting things in those spaces that we don't have a name for yet, that just, they require what I think is the original act of art, which is just making stuff and doing stuff and organizing stuff because you want to, because you thought of it, not because anybody ever paid you to do it, just because you could, almost because nobody could pay you for it, because you wanted to do it so bad, you know? And I think that to refine that energy in making things and making up things and playing cool, or, you know, any of the things you would invent as a child, you could do again as an adult, not because it has no other utility than an immediate one, than an immediate need in space with people. You know, that's my big picture. That's my utopia, to return to my, you know, 10-year-old self in the suburban woods. But it's also changes the career goals that we're expected to have as artists. And I think that's the exciting part, right? Like I can look at the sky and say, okay, we all see the same sun. That's a good start. Now, what will we all put our energy on? Let's get another question.
Yeah, let's do it. I just wanted to say I love what Stella Mars has put in the chat right now about looking at East Coast art in the last 20 years versus when she was growing up in the West Coast. And I just want to quote, like, when there was nothing and the only way to produce anything was to collaborate and occupy, which is like such a, love those verbs, right? But our next question will come from Helen Colton. And Helen, you should be able to turn on your microphone now.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for these beautiful presentations. One thing that I noticed as a common denominator between all of the work that was shown is this emphasis on interaction and constant activity, and almost kind of rethinking what we've been trained to look at in terms of like subject or object or time that can be measured as not being that at all, but completely in movement and interaction and more of a continuum. And as I was looking at the presentations and also the language that a lot of you were using, it reminded me of Karen Barad's agential realism. And I just became curious what type of philosophies or theories or different sources you're reading right now in terms of influencing your work.
Somebody want to jump in?
Let's just go in order of presentations, unless
That's
that puts
good.
you too much on the spot. Yes, sir.
Well, I am reading, hold a second.
I feel like this is the part of Zoom I love so much, is like how intimate and strange it's become, like how much we're in each other's homes, in the backdrop, etc. Okay, Yasue, go ahead.
Yes. Title is called Cynical Theories, written by Helen Flockroth and James Lindsay. My favorite scholars, James Lindsay as a mathematician background. Although the main theme of this book is re-critiquing the postmodernism, which is very rare since I came to jump into the art world. But I feel that almost finally there is a fair discussion to review what is a postmodern from both side view. Just I am still reading and then very exciting. So that's it.
I mean, the things that I end up reading have more to do with history than I think maybe science. But so right now I'm reading In the Shadow of Slavery, African Americans in New York City, 1626 to 1863. And it's really interesting because the first Angolans that came to New York were actually the farmers and the producers and the maintainers of, the original Dutch population. And, then it really tracks the I guess maybe, almost 400 years, a history of people establishing communities in any ways that they can, and then being kind of chased up northward until they get to Harlem in the 20th century, starting from where the Five Points area, Fresh Pond, is where the first Black community was in the 1860s. But anyway, so that, and there's a little book that I have about George Washington Carver that is something that I keep going back to because of his relationship to nature. And when he was a little boy, he would go out into the woods and talk to the woods and talk to the plants and learn from them. And that was his first laboratory, right? Like, what can nature teach me? Not unlike the video that Lisi, beautifully made. Like, what is, everything is always talking to us all the time. Can we hear it? How can we hear it? And so then what is it teaching us, and what is it telling us about, about the future?
Who wrote that book? Who wrote the book that you're reading right now?
I don't know. It's pretty weird.
I'll find it. That sounds like a good.
Okay.
It sounds like a book to read with a walking tour. I love that stuff.
Oh, yeah, I've been doing, so I want to say like reading is so much more fun when I can like read with. So right now I'm reading with the juniors, and we're reading Legacy Russell's Glitch Feminism. And I'm finding that to be like really helpful for me to like understand performativity and how the internet functions. And being like the generation that I am, where I'm I came to the internet at age 28. So there's a whole generation of artists that I'm learning about that is pretty amazing. We're also going to read Other Forms of Conviviality, which is a journal article put together by Constantina Zavistanos and Park MacArthur a few years back. And I want to utilize that so that like they're understanding like collaboration and like needing each other. And then we're going to get into Edward Glissant's The Poetics of Relation, probably for opacity. And so, yeah, so there's some questions there. And then like, as I'm moving through, like milling through by hand, these, just a library of plywood and basswood that I didn't ask permission to use. I just bought, but it's been like a lot of installations. So as I'm doing that, I'm finding that listening to Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass is just helping me connect a little bit to the problems of my previous practice, and just to approach the things with a different touch. So yeah, reading with and reading during, I think, are good ways to read for me.
Love thinking about that durational reading and reading with, and Braiding Sweetgrass, something that I recently read that I found transformative. I don't know where to start. I've been working on a project in Ecotopian Libraries. I've been finding a lot of books, and they've been their titles have been emailed to me, and I've been able to get them and accumulate them. I think around the science lens, Donella Meadows is somebody who I keep going back to. And Donella Meadows is a systems scientist who was writing about effective ways to change systems and looking at like how humans can influence systems. So she would say like an effective way is through an event like a protest, and even more effective way could be through changing an element of the system, like the CEO of a company or the president. And even more effective than that could be communication. So that's us, right? That's what artists do. And most effective would be changing the purpose of the system. And that takes all of those things to come together. And I've been trying to get into that a little bit more, and also some philosophies that come up around metamodernism, which is something that I was just introduced to. That
noted that the providence of the deity.
Yeah.
Sorry. Was that did you hear that? Is that am I?
No,
I'm
we never
unmuted.
heard it. Don't worry.
Yeah, you heard it.
Mary, it's all you.
Oh, that's all.
That's it. I love what you're saying about sort of systems, like thinking sort of like broader about like kind of societal change and what are the agents and what are the cogs. I feel like any one of these questions, we could sit on it for so long, but actually we've had a number of audience questions come in and I want to be respectful of time. So maybe we can like rapid mode them. And our next question, yeah, go ahead.
Can I just add to that? Is that the thing that I'm thinking that I'm reading that has to do with how the system might be arrived at is all British Enlightenment thinkers that got us to the moment of the founding, which I think is a really critical place to understand, because in closely tied to the science of the times, it's probably why we still think in the ways that we do. But that's my 2 cents. And
we're living in their nightmare. Yeah.
We live in their long shadow where it's, you know, we're turning over the soil because nothing can grow where they've stood.
Well, it'd be nice to know what they left us with, so that's why I'm reading it.
Yeah, I like that. Our next question will come from Ty Cooper, and Ty, you should be able to turn on your microphone whenever.
Hi. First, I want to thank all of you so much. These are all of my coworkers will know that these are like all of the things I want to talk about at all times. You know, hearing Lisi, you talk about glitch feminism, and Abigail talking about like thinking of past and like thinking about like world building and ways to break that. And my question for all of you was, I was being asked recently to think about ways in which the body or the self can out-survive the world. And I'm thinking about like the process of a body falling into a black hole and that endless bifurcation in which like nothing really ceases to exist. It just like gets deeper into things. And I was wondering what each of you think about the body in relationship to space, and both in the spatial way of like our current existence and in the larger way, and this idea of like lasting or out surviving, especially just considering how each of you have come so close to this concept today. I hope that was clear.
I feel like anyone can jump in whenever. Don't be shy.
I think I might realize that I'm not going to last. Like I'm aging, and this will be over soon. This incarnation of the body will be over soon. It feels really close. Yeah.
I just say, I think the big inspection for us culturally is to understand what your relationship is to religion or any other kind of superstition about what happens. And I think that the nation needs a really big sort of comeuppance with how that surrounds this story. You know, I think you guys might think of it differently than people my age, but I am sure that there's nothing after this, and that I'm sure that I won't survive this. And I feel like it's appropriate that humans don't survive it. And I know that sounds really dark, but I think it's a really good reason to be engaged with each other now.
It could be a very simple example, but in terms of our body, in relation to art, that I think this is a fundamental part of the reason that why I would be interested in a sculpture, because no matter what, we are driven by the story or narrative. fundamental truths, again, we have been refraining in this lecture that as the objects are simply, like if the object doesn't have enough maintenance, that it also falling apart as our body is also need a maintenance. So it's a very simple things. And there is that fact really limit our indulgence and the imagination and fantasizing the like beautiful like art. So I like this sharp reality, how to make a balance between the imagination and reality. So sculpture is a very good intersection to me.
And just to go back to what you said about, you know, like the body being eviscerated inside of a black hole, or the ways in which matter is completely destroyed, but the only thing that's left is the gravity of it, like the weight of it, right? Like in that, and the way that that shapes new, you know, that is happening simultaneously with the creation or development of a universe, right? Like that they always need this eviscerating kind of force at the same time that this creative thing is happening. And so then I don't think it's possible for us to die, right? Like then it's something else. Who knows what it is, right? And you can't say no one has a definitive answer as to what that is, right? But if there is always a continual like this duality in terms of massive evisceration, but the weight and presence and gravity of that and how that speaks over time and through history is happening. It's creating something new. Something new is always being created also within that simultaneously. So, yeah.
I think perhaps that is like the perfect place for us to move to poetry. How does everyone feel? Yeah? All right. I feel like I've enjoyed, for those in the audience, this event was really percolating and in the works for weeks, but truly months. And it's been like such a delight and such a pleasure to be in email and in conversation with like all of these phenomenal humans and bits of stars. So I feel like this is just the preview. But at the Rail, we have a tradition of ending with poetry. And today I'm thrilled to welcome our poet laureate of our lunchtime, Jennifer Soong, to the Zoom stage. She's the author of Near At, which came out with Future Poem back in 2019. And her second collection of poetry, Suede Mantis / Soft Rage, a beautiful title, is forthcoming with Black Sun Lit in 2022, something to look forward to. Her poems have been published all over the place in Social Text, Berkeley Poetry Review, Earthbound Press, Blazing Stadium, and here at the Brooklyn Rail. And when she's not writing verse, she's also a doctoral candidate at Princeton, where she's completing a dissertation called Poetic Forgetting, which I think is just so apt. So Jennifer, you should be able to take it away whenever. But everyone give it up for Jennifer Soong.
Thank you so much, Malvika. This panel has been so great, and it sort of reminded me of when I was writing my first book. I sort of discovered that my favorite part of speech was the verb, and which is the most temporal part of speech we have. And at the time I was thinking, how can I take what I love most about the verb, which is movement and change, and make the whole poem a kind of verb, really. So I'm just going to read two poems from my first book. One, I think, is interested in speed, so a fast time. And then the second one is slow, sort of thinking about geological time, which I think many of you today have sort of inspired me to think more about too. So the first poem is called Scrape Me From Your Mind, an Urge. Scrape me from your mind, an urge is the time, but crueler. Can't you hear the damage now? The shock held down by whirls of night thoughts intermingling. Our lives merged without shifting lanes, the contour outlined like a Basquiat, where skull shards are sewn up, sun-slept in a high voltage cadmium. Don't pick at the scab. I know you desperately want to because of that terrible chafing beneath the cortical surface. But subterranean is where memories, these, are most at ease. You once asked, how far must I go before I called this war my own? All through the forest, you searched for the painted cherries, buoyant bunches and the original legends. The glittering kaleidoscope weakened the compound mosquito eyes, but through the trees, the sun came in hexagons. You slipped the severed cities into sleeves and slit roads, long letters to everyone who left the deep cove of evergreens for the great urban epiphany. For months, no one responded. What myth is there but the one you construct? I knew style to be a mythical creature, but still I wanted and believed in a unified self. Didn't the poets pass us down and pass down the seeds of sorrow too? If words still take away so carefully the world, have them look our way at least. Hey, are you listening to the world happen? No one told the trees which way to grow. They readily loved, made sweet their own time. Down at the fruit-filled roads where baby peaches fall to their sound, looking as young gifts or clothed happiness do, all things are eventually taken, all things eventually asked. But if tomorrow the world crosses this way, starved for extinct breeds, let them know we let down arms for the suspension of low hollies held between. Nothing is ever just a look. It is always an affair, and time takes us everywhere down in its book. I scribble down another if, one that might catch me in its impenetrable look, hold me for just a lifetime long. Should it end here, I wouldn't mind too much. It's happened before to art, love, America, God, and all the kids are traveling to India these days. But would I encounter who it was that was? I thought she might come back, pick up what goods I forgot, paid for at the self-checkout station. There's nothing worse than walking with no shadow, but the occasional high beam isn't canopus after all, and the moon keeps breaking up on me. Oh, Dr. Neon, solve my migraine. Dr. Neon, they keep your motion sensor methods awake all night. From the other side of sealed sliding doors, I see the lettuce heads beginning to limp, the waxed ham suffocate through the plastic, Toucan Sam after Toucan Sam. The rain is red and dripping, dot matrices in myopia. Under 44th Street, I heard your expenditures cling to the clock's last digits. What sensitivities do I owe? I'm shaking off your debt. And then just one more. This one's called The New Awe. In mud, earth flexes, the slow, ancient contradiction of tense deliberation, a state of change bound to an underlying shift, the last human bones, rock and sheen of purple. The agitation there can be felt with adequate attention underneath and followed through to each pulsation. The lush verdict paid through channels so physical and various, they eradicate from fragmentation all trace of past fear. So each fragment wanders, all the while not losing the connecting angle, surfaces out the other end such dispersion of light like rainbow. The spectrum infiltrates on pines, shooting out mountainous pressure, that which sits upon a sage-like gentleness, never short of ongoing present tension. How the droplet would almost appear then as a solid, bound completely by free surfaces. We do not escape our lyricism, it seems, and urge can be known only when the destructive contact is not ultimately made or made into false need, hence preserved, momentarily impenetrable. Thank you so much.
I wish you could hear all the clapping.
Oh, perfect. Oh my
Look
God.
at you. Perfect poet for the day. I love that line about didn't the poets pass down the seeds of sorrow too. Thank you so much, Jennifer. And thank you so much to you, Lisi, Mary, Yasue, Abigail, and of course, thank you, Sheila, for bringing us all together today. It's been such a pleasure being your MC. And of course, thank you most of all to all of you who tuned in today in the audience and in the chat. Please join us again on Monday for the March Guest Critics panel when we'll have Sarah Cowan, Pac Pobrick, Caitlin Kramer, and Will Fenstermaker, what a name, in conversation with Rail Managing Editor Charlie Schultz. They've boldly titled this event To Declare a New World, which I think is very in keeping with the conversation we've had today. And that will be at our usual time right here in the Zoom at 1 p.m. Other than that, I'm going to drop some links in the chat and invite you all to turn on your mics. And here, give me a second. But this has been beautiful. Thank you all so much. I hope you have a beautiful rest of your day.
Thanks, Malvika.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Thanks
you.
so much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
So much.
Thanks, Sheila.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Really, really
Lisi.
great
Thanks,
conversation.
Yasue.
Thank you, Abigail.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Jennifer.
Sal.
Thanks,
Really great
Malvika.
conversation.
Thanks, Nick.
Thanks, Malvika.
Very, very
Thanks,
best.
Nick.
Thanks so much.